The fluorescent lights above checkout lane 7 had been buzzing since early morning, a kind of flat, indifferent hum that made everything feel slightly more exhausting than it needed to be. A woman stood at the register with both hands gripping the counter edge, her knuckles pale and tight. She was not angry. She was not arguing. She was simply holding on, the way a person holds on when the floor is tilted without warning, and they have not yet decided whether to ask for help. Her name was Norma Breckett, though the young man behind the register did not know that, and it was already clear he had no intention of learning it. He held her coupon envelope at arm's length, pinched between two fingers like something found at the bottom of a drain. And he was sighing in a way that was meant to be heard. The line behind Norma had grown to 6 people. She knew this because she had glanced back once, quickly, the way a person does when they are embarrassed and cannot help themselves from checking whether it shows. It showed. Every coupon she had brought was valid. She had checked them twice at home the night before, sitting under the kitchen lamp with her reading glasses and a cup of decaf, writing the expiration dates in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She had done this for 40 years since before this boy was born, and the coupons were fine. He kept sighing, and the line kept growing, and something small and quiet in Norma Breckett was beginning to crack. Then a voice came from directly behind her, steady, not loud, the kind of voice that did not require volume to land with a weight. "Take your time, ma'am. There's no rush here." Norma turned. The man standing there was tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind of stillness about him that you did not see often anymore. He was looking not at her, but at the cashier, and the large German shepherd sitting motionless at his left heel was looking there too. If you are the kind of person who ever wondered whether a dog could read a room, you would have had your answer in that moment. The dog had not moved, had not growled, had not done anything dramatic. His amber eyes had not left the young man's face since the moment that sigh was issued, and something in the quality of that stillness said everything the Marine standing behind him had chosen not to say yet. If this story stays with you, do not forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and watch all the way until the very end. His name was Decker Marsh, and he had come back to Hatchet Falls, Virginia, not because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else left to go that made any kind of sense. He was 41 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with dark hair cut short and going gray at the temples in a way that made him look not older, but more serious, as if the gray had arrived on purpose to communicate something he could not say with words alone. His face was weathered in the manner of a man who had spent most of his adult years outdoors in conditions that were not gentle, and there was a long, faint scar along his left jaw that he had stopped noticing years ago. His eyes were a quiet shade of brown, pale at the edges, and they moved constantly, cataloging without appearing to catalog, the habit of a man who had learned to treat every new environment as a potential problem until it proved otherwise. He had served for 17 years as a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps, 3 deployments overseas, and 4 years in disaster relief coordination that had taken him to flooded parishes in Louisiana, tornado-leveled towns in Kansas, and a wildfire corridor in Northern California, where he had carried 2 elderly men out of a burning structure on a Tuesday afternoon that still appeared in his dreams with reliable frequency. He had not planned to come home after his discharge. He had not planned anything in particular, which was itself unusual for a man who had spent nearly 2 decades planning everything. And the absence of a plan had felt, at first, like a kind of freedom he had earned. It had not taken long for that feeling to become something else. The dog beside him was named Broker, a name that had amused exactly no one, when Decker chose it, which was part of why he had chosen it. Broker was 6 years old, 78 pounds, black and tan with a saddle coat that caught the light differently, depending on the season. He had been Decker's partner through the last 4 years of active service, trained in search and scent work, and he had been with Decker through every unplanned month since the discharge, sleeping at the foot of whatever mattress was available, pressing his enormous warm head against Decker's knee during the nights that were difficult. Broker did not require explanation. He did not require performance. He simply remained, which was more than Decker could say for most things in his life at present. Hatchet Falls was a town of roughly 4,000 people in the Shenandoah foothills, the kind of place that appeared briefly on state maps between larger destinations, and was easy to drive through without stopping if you did not know what you were stopping for. Decker had grown up here, the son of a hardware store owner who had died of a stroke 7 years ago, and a mother who had died of grief 2 years after that, though the death certificate listed cardiac failure, and Decker had never disputed it. The house on Caldwell Road was still technically his. He had been paying the property taxes from wherever he was stationed without thinking too hard about it, the way you pay for something you intend to deal with later, and later keeps moving further out. He had arrived 3 weeks ago in his truck with Broker in the passenger seat and a duffel bag that fit in the truck bed without being secured, and he had stood in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The house needed work. He could see that from the driveway. He had been slowly identifying the list of things that needed fixing, and had been slower still to begin actually fixing them, and he had driven to the ShopRite on Dunmore Street this morning for lumber screws and weather stripping, which had placed him at checkout lane 7, just in time to hear a 20-something man with a name tag reading Cole release the specific brand of theatrical sigh that Decker had come to recognize across multiple theaters of operation as the sound of someone enjoying a small moment of power they had no business holding. Norma Breckett was 73 years old, 5 feet 3 and shrinking, with white hair that she set every Thursday at the beauty salon 2 blocks from her house and wore in a soft roll at the back of her head that suggested a woman who had once taken considerable pride in her appearance and had not stopped simply because the years had altered what was possible. She wore a tan coat with a velvet collar, the kind of coat that had once been fine and still was, if you looked carefully, which most people did not. Her hands shook slightly when she was cold or tired, and this morning she was both. She had been a school secretary at Hatchet Falls Elementary for 31 years, had known half the families in town by their children's names and their lost mitten histories and their parent-teacher conference cancellations, and had retired 8 years ago with a small pension that covered the basics and not much else. Her husband Bernard had died 4 years back. Since then, the coupons had become less about frugality and more about something harder to name. The feeling that being careful with what you had was a form of respect for the life you were living, a refusal to let things slide simply because no one was watching anymore. She had 17 coupons in her envelope, 11 of them scanned without issue. The 12th was for a brand of chicken broth that the store carried under a slightly different label than the one printed on the coupon, a variance of less than 1 word, and Cole had decided this constituted grounds for a full halt. He had called a supervisor who had not arrived. He had called again. He had sighed twice more and checked his phone, and Norma had apologized once, carefully, and said that she believed the coupon should apply because the product was identical, and Cole had responded with a look of patient exasperation that made the 2 women standing behind Decker exchange a glance that needed no words. Decker had been watching all of this from the moment he arrived in the lane. Broker had been watching it longer, having noticed the interaction from 8 feet back as they approached. The dog had settled into a precise stillness at Decker's side, ears forward, amber eyes tracking Cole with an attention that was calm but absolute. Decker had read that stillness and had read the room and had said what he said, simply about taking her time and there being no rush, and the effect on the lane had been immediate and difficult to describe precisely. Cole looked up from the coupon envelope. He was 24 years old, perhaps 25, with a tight jaw and the slightly aggrieved quality of a young man who was accustomed to minor authority going unchallenged. His eyes went to Decker, then dropped to Broker, and something rearranged itself briefly behind his face. "These coupons have a product matching issue," Cole said. His voice was still carrying the performance of authority, but the volume had adjusted. "I'm waiting on a supervisor." "The product is identical," Decker said. He did not elaborate. He did not raise his voice. Cole looked at Norma's envelope again. He looked at Decker. He looked at Broker, whose gaze had not moved. Cole scanned the 12th coupon. It accepted. He continued through the remaining 6 without comment. Norma's hands were still shaking slightly when she gathered her bags, but she had straightened her coat, and the pale grip on the counter edge had released. She moved toward the exit slowly, the way a person moves when they are not sure whether to look back, and then she did look back at Decker, and she said, "Thank you, young man." Her voice was composed. Her eyes were something else, and Decker held the look for a moment before nodding once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Broker watched her go. Decker placed his lumber screws and weather stripping on the belt. He did not look at Cole again. Outside, the January morning was gray and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that had moved in from the northwest the night before and was settling over the Shenandoah foothills like it intended to stay. Decker loaded his bag into the truck and opened the passenger door for Broker, who stepped up with the economy of a working animal and arranged himself in the seat. Decker sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. He had not expected to feel anything driving into that parking lot. He had not expected to feel anything in this town at all, not yet, maybe not ever. That was the arrangement he had made with himself when he came back, that he would fix the house and figure out the next step and not involve himself in anything that was not his business to be involved in. An old woman at a grocery register was not his business, except that she was. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. He started the engine. Broker rested his chin on the edge of the passenger window and watched the parking lot as they pulled out, his breath making small clouds against the cold glass. Decker took the long way back to Caldwell Road, without meaning to, through the center of town, past the hardware store his father had run for 22 years, the windows now occupied by an insurance agency that kept its blinds half closed, and past the elementary school where a woman he did not know had spent 3 decades learning the names of children, and past the small brick library that was still there, still open, with a handmade sign in the window advertising a Tuesday reading group that he noticed without intending to. He had come home to fix a house. He had not come home to be fixed. He was still deciding whether those were separate things or the same thing approached from different directions. The house on Caldwell Road sat on 3/4 of an acre at the end of a gravel lane edged with old cedar trees, 2-story clapboard, white paint gone to cream in places, a covered front porch with one post that had rotted and been replaced with a temporary support Decker's father had installed 20 years ago and which still stood only out of stubbornness. The property had the look of a place that had been well loved and then left, not abandoned, not ruined, just paused at the moment someone important departed and not resumed. Decker had been spending his mornings in systematic assessment, moving room to room with a yellow legal pad, noting what needed doing in order of structural priority. The list was long. He had begun to find the work steadying in a way that surprised him. The simple fact of having a material problem with a material solution, a thing that could be measured and fixed and known to be fixed when it was finished. By afternoon, he had installed the weather stripping on both the rear door and the mudroom entry, had pulled the temporary porch post, and begun measuring for the replacement, and was standing in the kitchen making coffee when his phone buzzed with a number he did not recognize. He almost let it go. "This is Decker," he said. A woman's voice, measured and a little cautious, said his name back to him as a question. "This is Helen Faber. I run the Faber's Dry Goods on 2nd Street. I was given your number by Pete Aldrich at the hardware. He said you might be the man who helped Norma Breckett at ShopRite this morning." Decker leaned against the counter. "I didn't do much," he said. "She might disagree," Helen said. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried more weight than the words around it. Norma's had a hard few months. She lost her sister in October, and then there was a situation with her landlord that I think you should know about if you have 5 minutes. He had 5 minutes. What Helen Faber told him in the next 12 took longer to process than the telling itself. Norma Breckett rented the house she lived in on Millrace Street from a company called Hargrove Property Solutions, which had purchased the property 18 months ago from the family of the previous owner who had died without a clear succession plan. Before Hargrove, Norma had rented from the DeWitt family for 11 years at a fixed rate that reflected a local landlord's understanding of what a retired school secretary on a fixed income could reasonably pay. Hargrove was not a local landlord. Hargrove had sent Norma a lease amendment 6 weeks ago, increasing her monthly rent by $240, effective in 60 days. The notice had arrived on a Friday. Norma had called the number on the letterhead and reached a voicemail box. She had written a letter. She had called again. She had spoken, finally, to a man named Dale Beaumont, who had a smooth, patient voice and had explained that the increase reflected current market conditions and that Norma was welcome to discuss a payment plan if the adjustment presented difficulties. What Beaumont had not mentioned, and what Helen Faber had learned from her nephew, who worked at the county assessor's office, was that Hargrove had filed a notice of intent to convert the Millrace Street property from residential rental to commercial use, a filing that would, if approved, terminate Norma's tenancy entirely within 5 months. Norma did not know about the filing. She knew only about the rent increase, which she had begun paying by reducing her grocery budget, which was where the coupon envelope came from, which was where Decker came in. Broker was sitting at the edge of the kitchen, watching Decker's face while he listened. When Decker ended the call and set the phone on the counter, Broker did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and sat down directly beside Decker's left boot, the way he did when he had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion the human had not yet verbalized. Decker looked down at him. "I know," he said. He poured his coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the cedar trees. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest, bending the tops of the cedars in a slow, rhythmic arc. He had come home to fix a house. The house was right here, with its missing porch post and its drafty rear door and its list of material problems with material solutions. What was happening to a 73-year-old woman on Millrace Street was not his house to fix. He drank half his coffee. He put on his coat. Helen Faber ran the dry goods store on 2nd Street with the particular competence of a woman who had inherited the business from her parents and had spent 30 years improving on what she inherited without losing what made it worth inheriting. She was 57, square-shouldered and practical, with reading glasses on a chain and gray-streaked brown hair cut short and no nonsense. Her handshake was firm in the way that had nothing to do with proving anything. The store smelled of cedar blocks and coffee and the particular warm dryness of a building that had been heated by the same system for decades. Broker sat between them at the small table in the back room Helen used for deliveries and bookkeeping, and he laid his chin on the edge of the table in a way that was not asking for permission and was not threatening anything, but simply indicated that he intended to be part of whatever was being discussed. Helen looked at the dog for a moment with the expression of someone deciding not to ask a question they had already answered. She told Decker what she knew in full, which was more than she had shared on the phone because some things were easier to say, with a person sitting across from you and a dog bearing witness. Norma had no family nearby. Her son lived in Colorado and called every 2 weeks and would help financially if asked, but Norma had not asked and had not mentioned the rent situation. Her sister's death in October had been the kind of grief that left a person slightly smaller than they had been, and Norma had been carrying it quietly the way she carried most things, by continuing to show up in her tan coat with her velvet collar and her coupon envelope and her careful notebook. Because that was what you did when your life had always been a matter of careful management of modest resources, and you did not know another way to proceed. Hargrove's commercial conversion filing, if it moved forward, would be heard by the county zoning board in approximately 4 months. Helen had a cousin who was an attorney in Charlottesville who had reviewed the filing and said there were grounds for a challenge if the conversion disrupted the residential character of the block and if adequate notice had not been provided in compliance with state tenant protection law. The attorney had also said that it was the kind of challenge that benefited substantially from community presence at the zoning hearing and from documentation of the rental relationship's history and the tenant's long-term ties to the community, and from someone who knew how to organize those elements into a coherent record before the hearing date. Helen had looked at Decker when she said this last part. Decker had looked at the table. Broker had looked at Decker. "I'm going to need to see the filing documents," Decker said after a moment. "And the original lease, if she has it." "She has it," Helen said. "She has everything. She's been a secretary for 30 years. She has a folder." The folder was a green hanging file organized by year, and when Norma Breckett set it on her kitchen table and opened it with steady hands, Decker felt something move through him that he could not immediately name. It was not admiration exactly, though it was close to that. It was something closer to recognition, the way you recognize in another person a quality you yourself possess but rarely see mirrored back clearly. The 30 years of receipts and lease copies and correspondence were organized with the same discipline he had applied to mission briefings and supply manifests and post-incident reports, not because someone required it, but because she believed, as he believed, that order was a form of respect for the reality you were trying to navigate. He sat at her kitchen table while Broker settled quietly near the back door, and he read through every document she handed him and took notes on a legal pad, and Norma made tea he did not drink but appreciated. And they talked about what she remembered about the conversion filing notice, which she had not received, and about every interaction with Dale Beaumont, which she had documented with dates and times in her notebook. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and the particular accumulated comfort of a house where a woman had lived carefully and well for many years. The refrigerator had a photograph held by a magnet, Norma and a woman who looked enough like her to be her sister, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, the photograph taken perhaps 15 years ago in better weather. Decker did not mention it. He saw it, and he sat with it for a moment as he turned to the next page in the folder, and the weight of it settled somewhere in his chest alongside the weight of the other things he was carrying. "He came here once," Norma said. "Beaumont. About 3 weeks ago." He rang the doorbell and stood on the porch with a folder of his own. She described him with the precision of a woman who had spent decades observing people and knew what to notice. Dale Beaumont was approximately 50, medium height, dressed in a dark overcoat that was expensive and slightly too formal for a front porch visit in Hatchet Falls. He had a round, pleasant face and a practiced, warm manner, and he had stood just slightly too close to the doorframe in a way that was subtle enough to be possibly accidental, but wasn't. He had told Norma that Hargrove understood this was a difficult adjustment, and that the company genuinely wanted to work with long-term tenants, and that he was personally committed to finding a solution that worked for everyone. He had left a business card. He had shaken Norma's hand. Broker, who had been outside at this point, tied at the porch rail by a leash Decker had left with Helen to give to Norma for the day, in case he needed her help with something, had stood up from where he was lying at the moment Beaumont appeared at the door and had remained standing, ears forward, for the entirety of the conversation. Norma had noticed this. She had mentioned it because she thought it might be relevant. Decker thought it was very relevant indeed. The next morning was colder still, the kind of cold that had come down out of the mountains and was taking its time leaving, and Decker drove first to the county assessor's office on Main Street, where Helen's nephew confirmed the filing and provided a printed copy, and then to the county clerk's office, where he requested copies of Hargrove Property Solutions' full filing record in Hargrove County, which took 40 minutes and cost him $11 in printing fees, and was worth considerably more than that. Hargrove had acquired 7 residential properties in the county in the past 22 months. 3 of those had already been converted to commercial use following zoning approvals. The tenants in those properties had been displaced. 2 of them, Decker learned by way of the clerk's desk assistant. A young woman named Priya, who had grown up in Hatchet Falls and had opinions about the matter, had been elderly residents with long rental histories. One of them had been in the same property for 14 years. Decker sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot with Broker on the seat beside him and read through the documents. The pattern was clear once you had the documents in front of you in order. Hargrove acquired properties below market rate from families in transition, typically estates or situations where the existing owner needed liquidity quickly. They filed for commercial conversion at the county level before notifying tenants, which was not technically illegal, but placed tenants in the position of responding to a process already in motion. The rent increase served 2 purposes simultaneously. It generated additional revenue in the interim period, and it created conditions under which a tenant might choose to leave voluntarily rather than face the zoning hearing. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was the kind of operation that worked precisely because it looked, at every step, like ordinary business. Decker had met this particular species of predation before. Not in uniform, but close enough to recognize the shape of it. The fact that it wore an expensive overcoat and introduced itself warmly did not change what it was. He had one more stop. Helen had told him, at the end of their conversation the previous day, almost as an afterthought, that there was a man named Carl Prentice who had lived on Dunmore Street his whole life and was something between a local historian and a professional grudge holder, regarding anyone who tried to change what Hatchet Falls was, and that Carl would know things about Hargrove that the county records would not contain, and that he could be found most mornings at the Round Cup Diner on Route 9. Carl Prentice was 66 years old, built like a man who had spent his working life in physical labor and whose body had decided to keep the record of it, with a broad, scarred face and white eyebrows and hands that could have been carved out of the same hickory as the counter stools. He looked at Broker when Decker sat down across from him and said, "Good-looking animal." He said it the way veterans say things about each other's dogs, which contained a whole other conversation Decker did not need to have out loud. Carl knew about Hargrove. He had known about them since the second property acquisition, had filed a complaint with the county that had been reviewed and closed without action, and had been gathering information in the methodical, slightly obsessive manner of a man who understood that the kind of people who operated the way Hargrove operated depended almost entirely on the fact that nobody was paying close enough attention for long enough. He had a file of his own. It was not as organized as Norma's, but it was comprehensive in a different way. The kind of file kept by someone who was angry and had channeled that anger into documentation, which was the most productive thing you could do with it. He and Decker sat at the counter for 2 hours over coffee and compared documents, and by the end of it they had a fairly complete picture of Hargrove's operating pattern in the county and a specific evidentiary gap that Decker intended to close. "The problem," Carl said, "is that every individual piece of what they're doing is legal. You need them to make one move that isn't, or you need enough community presence at the zoning hearing to make the board think twice before approving." "Or both," Decker said. "Or both," Carl agreed. Broker, who had been sitting quietly between the two counter stools throughout this conversation, turned his head toward the diner's front window at that moment, his ears lifting. A dark green sedan had slowed on Route 9 and was moving through the parking lot at a speed that was consistent with someone looking for a parking space, if a parking space was what they were looking for. It continued through the lot without stopping and pulled back onto the highway. Decker watched it go. He pulled out his phone and noted the time. Over the following 2 weeks, Decker developed the kind of routine he had not had since leaving active service, the kind that had both structure and purpose in it, and that his body recognized at a cellular level as belonging. He was at the house on Caldwell Road each morning by 7, working through the repair list with the methodical focus he had always applied to material problems. The front porch post was replaced and painted, 3 windows recaulked and sealed, the kitchen floor's soft spots addressed from beneath. The work was grounding in the most literal sense, his hands in contact with the physical reality of a place that had formed him and that he was now, quietly reforming in return. Broker moved through the property each morning ahead of him, the same systematic circuit, checking the tree line and the lane and the adjacent yard with the unhurried thoroughness of an animal who understood that thorough and slow were not the same as hesitant. In the afternoons, Decker worked the Hargrove documentation. He had obtained from Norma, with her permission, copies of every lease amendment and every written correspondence, and had arranged them alongside the county filing records in Carl's accumulated file into a chronological timeline that told the story of Hargrove's operation in a form that was clear and sequenced and would be legible to someone encountering it for the first time. He had called Helen's cousin in Charlottesville, the attorney whose name was Michelle Okafor, and had walked her through the documentation by phone. She had been quiet for a long time after he finished, and then she had said that the timeline was the most coherent thing she had seen on this situation, and that she wanted a copy of everything. He sent it to her the same afternoon. He had also, in consultation with Carl, placed 2 weather-resistant cameras at angles, covering the front approach and the parking area of Millrace Street. This was done openly, with Norma's knowledge and permission, and was explained to her as a precaution in case anyone with a folder and an expensive overcoat decided to make another doorbell visit. Norma had said, I appreciate that, Decker," in a tone that suggested she understood it as more than a precaution. It was during the 3rd day of this routine that Norma's neighbor, a retired mail carrier named Ed Sutter, who was 68 and walked with a cane since a hip replacement the previous spring, appeared at her front gate while Decker was installing the 2nd camera and said he had heard from Helen Faber that something was happening with Norma's situation, and he wanted to know what he could do. He had lived next door to Norma for 11 years and had shoveled her walk every winter without being asked, and knew about Bernard and knew about the sister who died in October, and had once, years ago, been helped out of a rough financial stretch by a man in this town who asked for nothing in return, and Ed had been looking for a place to put that debt ever since. Broker walked over to where Ed stood at the gate, sat down in front of him, and stayed there while Ed scratched his ears with the unhurried generosity of a man with nothing to prove and nowhere to be. Decker watched this and felt the thing in his chest that was not admiration exactly, but was close. By the end of that week, there were 4 people who knew about the Hargrove situation and were willing to appear at the zoning hearing. By the end of the following week, there were 11. The afternoon it nearly came apart started with a phone call to Norma from a number she recognized. Dale Beaumont called on a Wednesday, mid-February, 4 days after Michelle Okafor had submitted a formal legal challenge to the commercial conversion filing on Norma's behalf. His voice was still smooth and his manner was still warm, but something in the construction of his sentences had changed. He asked Norma if she had retained legal counsel, and she said she had, and he said he understood, and that Hargrove remained committed to finding a solution that worked for everyone. And then he said something that Norma wrote down in her notebook immediately after the call ended, word for word, because she recognized it as a thing to write down. He said, "Sometimes the most disruptive part of a situation like this is the involvement of people who don't fully understand the legal complexity, and it might be better for everyone, including people you care about, if this stayed between you and us." Norma called Decker. She read him the sentence from her notebook. Decker sat with it for a moment. "Did he say anything else?" "No. He said he would be in touch. And then he said to enjoy the rest of the day." Broker was lying in the kitchen doorway and had lifted his head when the call came in. He was still watching Decker's face. Decker thanked Norma, told her to save the notebook page, and ended the call. He called Michelle Okafor next and read her the sentence from his own notes. She said, very quietly, "That is not a wise thing for him to have said." "No," Decker agreed. "We should talk about what comes next." 2 days later, Decker drove the 40 miles to Charlottesville and sat in Michelle Okafor's office, which was on the 3rd floor of a building that faced a small park, and he went through the documentation with her in person for 2 hours. Michelle was 44 years old, tall and precise, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses. She pushed up to her forehead when she was thinking, and brought back down when she was reading, and she had the quality that good attorneys share with good sergeants, which is the ability to hear the version of events that matters without requiring the version that doesn't. She told him that Beaumont's remark constituted potential harassment, which, if documented by Norma's own contemporaneous notation, added a significant dimension to the challenge. She told him that the county zoning board hearing was scheduled for the 14th of March, 6 weeks out, and that she needed 12 things from Decker by the end of the following week. He wrote them down. He had them to her in 5 days. The dark sedan appeared again the following week, this time parked on the cross street off Mill Race, visible from the angle of camera 2. It stayed for 40 minutes between the hours of 7 and 8 in the evening, which was when the lights in Norma's front room were on and visible from the street. The footage was clear and time-stamped. Decker sent the file to Michelle and to Deputy Sheriff Renata Clay, who he had called for the first time 10 days earlier after Carl Prentice told him that Renata's grandmother had been one of the tenants displaced in Hargrove's second conversion. Renata was 36, compact and precise, with a cropped dark braid and the even-tempered watchfulness of a person who had decided a long time ago to be useful rather than impressive. She had looked at Decker's documentation in the first meeting with the expression of someone who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to show up with a complete file. She had run Hargrove Property Solutions through the State Business Registry and had found 2 unresolved complaints from other counties, one of which involved a displaced tenant who had documented direct pressure not entirely unlike what Beaumont had said to Norma on the phone. She had forwarded those to the State Housing Authority contact she maintained and was waiting for a response. When the surveillance footage of the sedan arrived, she looked at it for a long time. "That's him," she said. She had recognized the plates. She filed a report and made a call she had been waiting for a reason to make, and the State Housing Authority opened a formal review of Hargrove's practices in the county, which was a thing that, once opened, was very difficult to close without going somewhere. Decker did not learn this immediately. He learned it on a Saturday morning from Renata, who called while he was replacing the 3rd rotten board on the Caldwell Road porch. He sat down on the porch steps with the phone, and Broker came and sat beside him, leaning lightly against his leg in the way he did when the news was the kind that needed a moment. Decker put his hand on the back of the dog's neck. "Okay," he said when Renata finished. "All right." He sat there for a while. The February morning was still cold, but something had shifted in the light, the way it does just before February relents. A suggestion of angle rather than warmth, but a suggestion nonetheless. He thought about Norma at the register, her hands white on the counter. He thought about Ed Sutter at the gate. No plan in particular, just the plain knowledge that he wanted to do something. He thought about Carl Prentice at the diner counter, with his file that was angry and comprehensive, and had been waiting for the right moment. He thought about how none of them had needed to be asked to show up. They had simply known where the work was and had brought themselves to it. That was the thing about this town. And it was the thing he had been resisting since he arrived, the way you resist a thing you are afraid to need. He had been afraid to need it. He was still afraid. He was sitting on his porch on Caldwell Road, and the work was here, and there was a dog leaning against his leg, and that was more than he had had in a long time. The zoning hearing was on a Thursday. Michelle Okafor had submitted the formal legal challenge and the documentation of Beaumont's phone call and the camera footage, and the State Housing Authority review was on record with the board. 11 community members had submitted written testimony, and 7 had arranged to appear in person. Carl Prentice had written 4 pages in a clear, unhappy hand about what the conversions had already done to the residential character of 2 blocks in town. Ed Sutter had written 2 paragraphs that said everything necessary and nothing more. Norma had submitted her folder, the whole 30-year record, organized and tabbed, which the board received in near silence. Dale Beaumont appeared at the hearing in his expensive overcoat. He sat on the opposite side of the room with 2 men in suits and a municipal attorney, and the practiced expression of a person accustomed to these proceedings, producing a particular outcome. He had not changed the expression when Michelle Okafor presented the documentation of his phone call, and he had not changed it when Renata Clay's written statement was read into the record. And he had not changed it visibly when the board chair announced a 30-day administrative hold on the conversion application pending the state review. He had maintained the expression even as he gathered his folder from the table and filed out, and Decker, who had spent 17 years reading the faces of people under pressure, understood that the expression was the only thing left Beaumont had full control of, and that he was holding it because letting it go would mean acknowledging what the room already knew. That was its own kind of conclusion, not a dramatic one, not a satisfying one in the way that stories sometimes promise. A real one, the kind that comes from evidence and persistence, and from 11 people deciding that the Millrace Street property and the woman who lived in it were worth the effort of showing up. Afterward, in the parking lot, with the late afternoon sun cutting thin and cold across the courthouse square, Norma stood with Decker for a moment. Broker had been in the truck during the hearing, and Decker had led him across the parking lot, and Norma crouched slowly and carefully, and let Broker smell her hand, and then rested her palm lightly on his broad head, and held it there. "He was with you that morning," she said. "At the store." "He's with me most places," Decker said. She nodded. She was looking at the dog the way people look at the things that have held them up without their having realized it. "Bernard would have liked him," she said. Decker did not say anything. He did not need to. That hit him harder than he expected, and he stood with it in the cold parking lot, and the pressure in his chest that he had been careful with for weeks had somewhere to go finally, and he let it go quietly, the way you let something go when you are standing outside in January and no one needs to see it. March arrived with the particular tentative warmth of a season testing whether it was welcome. The State Housing Authority review moved forward, and Hargrove Property Solutions filed for a 60-day extension on all pending county applications, which was a paperwork move that everyone who had been paying attention understood as the first motion of a company deciding whether to leave quietly or wait to see how the wind settled. Michelle Okafor had told Decker that the extension was a good sign. Carl Prentice had said it was a coward's move, which Decker thought was both correct and not mutually exclusive with good. Renata Clay had said nothing beyond that she would continue watching the filing record, which was all that needed to be said. The 11 community members who had submitted testimony were still 11 community members who had submitted testimony, and the records were filed, and the documentation existed, and a woman named Norma Breckett knew that the particulars of her situation had been seen and held by people who chose to hold them, which was, in the end, a different kind of protection than any legal outcome could fully provide. Ed Sutter finished the winter shoveling Norma's walk. Helen Faber began stocking the brand of chicken broth that the coupon had been for, which she announced without fanfare on the small chalkboard by the store entrance where she noted weekly specials, and which Norma saw on a Tuesday and understood without anyone explaining it. Carl Prentice sent Decker a text message that contained only 3 words and a period, which, given Carl's demonstrated relationship to punctuation, was something close to a speech. The text said, "Good work, Maureen." Decker read it in his truck outside the hardware store and set the phone on the seat and sat for a moment. Broker had his head on the edge of the window, watching the street, tracking the slow, ordinary movement of the morning, the woman with the stroller, the 2 men with coffee cups talking in front of the insurance office that used to be a hardware store, the mail carrier moving up the sidewalk with the easy familiarity of a person who knew every address and chose to know it. The gray in Decker's temples had not gone anywhere. The list on the legal pad was shorter, but not finished. The house on Caldwell Road needed 3 more windows and a section of the second-floor subfloor and a back fence post that had been leaning since the last hard frost. He had the materials in the truck bed and the afternoon to use them. On the 3rd Saturday of March, 9 people appeared at the Caldwell Road property without being explicitly invited, only informed, by a chain of communication that had started with Helen Faber and moved through the town in the way that certain things move through a town that is still, at its core, the kind of place where people know which houses need tending and consider it their business to tend them. Ed Sutter came with his nephew, who was 22 and strong, and who Ed introduced as the part of me that still bends without complaining. Carl Prentice came with a truck bed full of lumber that was exactly what was needed, without Decker having told him what was needed. A man named George Haney, who had been in the Army in a different decade, arrived with 2 sawhorses and an electric sander, and the information that he had heard there was a porch situation. A woman named Patty Morse, who ran the diner where Carl and Decker had talked for 2 hours over coffee, arrived with a covered dish that turned out to be pulled pork, and the information that she was not staying, but that they should eat something. Norma came with her green hanging file, which she did not need for any practical purpose that day, but which she set on the porch railing while she sat in the chair Decker had placed there for her, and which she rested her hand on while she watched the work, the way a person rests a hand on something they have carried a long way and have finally set down. Broker moved through the yard and among the people with the particular careful dignity of a working dog who understood that this gathering was not a threat to be assessed, but a thing to be honored with his presence, and he moved from person to person and received their hands on his head and their brief rough words and their offered pieces of whatever was in their pockets. And when he was finished making his circuit, he returned to the foot of the porch steps and settled and did not leave. The afternoon was cold, but the sky had cleared for the first time in weeks, a thin, pale blue above the cedar trees, the kind of sky that belongs to March when it is trying, and the sound of the work, hammers and the sander and voices calling measurements, and the occasional dry crack of Carl saying something about lumber quality that was technically a complaint, but functionally an expression of happiness, moved through the yard in the way that the sound of work moves when the people doing it are doing it for the right reason. Decker was on the 2nd story with a section of subfloor when he heard Norma below him say something to Ed Sutter, low enough that he could not make out the words. He heard Ed respond, and then he heard Norma laugh. It was a brief sound, not large, not the laugh of a woman without grief, but the laugh of one who had found something real enough to laugh at despite it, and it went up through the open window, and Decker heard it and paused with his hands on the subfloor for a moment and did not move. Below him, outside, Broker heard it too. He lifted his head from his pause at the foot of the porch steps and looked toward where the sound had come from, and his tail moved once, slowly, against the cold ground. That was all. It was enough. By mid-April, Hargrove Property Solutions withdrew its commercial conversion application for the Millrace Street property. The withdrawal came quietly, documented in a county filing notice that Renata Clay forwarded to Decker on a Wednesday morning, with a single line of text that said only the filing reference number and withdrawn. The State Housing Authority review remained open and was examining Hargrove's other county properties, which was a process that would take time and produce an outcome that was not Decker's to control. He understood that. Some things were too large to finish and too important to abandon, and the only honest relationship you could have with them was to do your part and trust that enough other people were doing theirs. Norma's lease was renewed at its original rate. She received the amended documentation in the mail and called Decker to tell him, and her voice had the quality of a woman who had been holding something braced and had now been permitted to set it down. "I want to have you to dinner," she said. "You and Broker both." "I'd like that," Decker said. He meant it. He was still surprised that he meant it. They had dinner on a Thursday evening in April, in the kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and old wood and the accumulated comfort of a life lived carefully. Norma had made a roast, and there was bread that she had baked from a recipe she had been making since her mother taught it to her in 1974. And she told him this, and he asked her what had changed in the recipe since then, and she told him that too. And they sat at the table for 2 hours while the evening darkened outside the kitchen window, and Broker lay stretched on the linoleum near the back door in the specific posture of a dog who has decided a place is safe and intends to remain. At one point, Norma looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, the one of her and her sister laughing at something outside the frame, and she was quiet for a moment, and Decker was quiet too. Then she said, "She would have thought you were ridiculous, you know. A Marine with a German Shepherd showing up over coupons." "She'd have been mostly right," Decker said. Norma looked at him. Something in her face was making an assessment the way her hands had made an assessment of the original lease documents 45 years ago, carefully and without rushing, checking whether the thing was what it said it was. "You're staying," she said. It was not a question. He had known it for a while without having said it. He had known it on the porch in February, with the February light, and the dog against his leg. He had known it when he started fixing things past the structural necessities, when the work had moved from obligation into something that felt like choice. He had come home to fix a house. The house had not needed to be fixed so much as it had needed to be lived in again, which was a different problem and a harder one, and he had been working on it, not all at once, but steadily, the way you approach a thing that matters. "I'm staying," he said. It was the first time he had said it out loud. It sat in the air between them in the kitchen, with the smell of the bread and the sound of Broker breathing quietly near the door, and Norma nodded once with the precision of a woman who had known the answer before she asked the question, and had asked anyway because some things needed to be said in words. Outside, the April evening was cold and still, the long blue dusk of Virginia in the shoulder season, settling over the cedar trees and the repaired porch, and the house on Caldwell Road where a light was on in the second-floor room Decker had begun to think of as his. The photograph on the refrigerator, the green hanging file on the counter, the sound of a town that was the kind of town where people knew which houses needed tending. He had not expected to find that still intact. He had not expected to find that anything was still intact. That was the thing about coming home when you had waited long enough. You expected the worst and found instead that things had continued without you, carrying what could be carried, waiting for the rest to be brought back by whoever was willing to bring it. Broker raised his head from the linoleum and looked at Decker across the kitchen with the amber-eyed attention of an animal who had been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for the human beside him to arrive at a conclusion that was never really in question. Then he laid his head back down on his paws and closed his eyes. He was home. He had known it first, the way he always did. If the people in the story remind you of anyone, it is because the kind of goodness they represent is not rare. It has always been here, steady and particular, showing up at gates with no plan except the knowledge of where the work is. Norma is here. Ed is here. Helen and Carl and Renata are here, doing what they do with nothing asked in return. And somewhere, a man in a tan coat with a good dog is still working through a list, fixing what needs fixing, staying when it is hard to stay. That is the quiet work of a life. That is the only kind of heroism most of us will ever be called to practice, and it is enough. It is more than enough. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep someone good nearby when you need them most.